All right, everybody. Good morning. It's 9:01, so I'll go ahead and get started. We are waiting on Grant. We aren't waiting, but Grant Irving from Pittsburgh will also be joining us momentarily. So I just wanted to say hello and thank you so much for joining what's going to be an excellent conversation today. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our outstanding panelists and to you in the audience. It's always fantastic to see so many new and familiar names amongst those registered for the event today. And while I'm talking, please go ahead and type your name, organization, and where you are this morning into the chat to help build connections. So my name is Kyra Newmoff Shields. I live in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm the director of the Bright Cities program at the nationwide nonprofit Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. Our goal is to lower exposures to harmful chemicals like toxic air pollutants, lead, arsenic, and others that harm babies' brain development, especially for babies that are disproportionately impacted by structural injustice and racial inequalities. In our previous conversations in this series, our panelists have brought key points to light, like the community owns the table and they need to be the ones driving the solutions, that government should see itself as a facilitator and an empowerer of the best solutions that emerge from community, and that by rethinking how we make decisions and making them human-centered first, it helps us to change course to be more responsible, and that there's still not enough communication across different cities to lift up the organic solutions that are helping in one community and could be useful in another. So today's panelists will help us build upon these points to think about how to more pragmatically drive forward our own climate resilience and/or sustainability planning, including lifting up the co-benefits of protecting babies and thinking about how to access the federal infrastructure funding to proactively move our work forward. So at any time during the conversation today, please type your questions into the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. The webinar is being recorded and we'll post the complete recording by tomorrow and a short highlights clip by the end of the month. And we really encourage and hope that folks will refer back to the learning in these video conversations. And to help us act on this learning, we'll also post today and share with all the webinar attendees an RFP for 4 $5,000 awards to put into practice one thing learned from these webinar conversations. So please plan to share your project idea with me by April 16th, and I really hope to hear from all of you. So without further ado, 3 national thought leaders and practitioners, Lottie Ferguson, Grant Irvin, and Kristen Baja, will address questions to help us shape steps to equitably reduce exposures to neurotoxins. And first, I'd like to introduce Lottie Ferguson. Lottie is the inaugural Chief Resilience Officer of Flint, Michigan. She's spearheaded multiple city initiatives, including programs to remove lead from Flint homes and build resilience after trauma. She currently has a big and exciting task in front of her and is convening city leaders to create and implement a resilience plan that complements the city's master plan. Welcome, Lottie, and thanks so much for being here. What motivated you to take part in today's conversation?
Well, first off, thank you so much for the invitation to join you. But the big motivator actually was you, your bright smile and your willingness to help make sure that babies across the country have bright futures. So I just wanted to be a part of that. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Lottie. It's great to have you. Our next panelist is Grant Irvin. He's the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Director for the Department of City Planning in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Grant helped lead the development of a variety of innovative programs, including Pittsburgh's One PGH Resilience Strategy, the Pittsburgh Climate Plan, the creation of the Uptown Eco-Innovation District, and others. Welcome, Grant. I'm really pleased that you're here. And why is today's conversation important to you?
Hi all, and thank you. So it's great to be with everyone, and it's an important conversation for us because, you know, one of the things we're always looking for is to learn from other places in order to apply those lessons learned to help improve the communities here in Pittsburgh and to effectively improve our residents' lives. So I'm hoping to gain a couple of good nuggets from my fellow panelists so I can steal their ideas and apply them in Pittsburgh.
Thank you. I've heard idea stealing is always a good thing amongst cities. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Kristen Baja. Baja is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network Climate Resilience Officer and helps cities identify strategic ways to advance climate resilience planning and implementation and build their capacity to take proactive action. Baja was recognized by the Obama administration as a champion of change for her work on climate and equity in 2016. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here, Baja. And what do you hope to share and gain from today's conversation?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And with any presentation, first, I just want to acknowledge that I'm standing on stolen land, specifically the traditional lands of the Piscotay people and the original indigenous tribe here now in the area called Baltimore. I also want to acknowledge that I'm a white woman living in a white body, and we're about to talk about resilience. And for me, racial equity and resilience are completely intertwined. And so I need to acknowledge my own positionality in the space. The reason I'm here is to be able to have this incredible conversation with Grant and Lottie, to learn from them. They're incredible leaders, and also to just acknowledge that there are some other incredible USDN members on the call, and I think it will lead to a great opportunity to collaborate and connect.
Thanks so much for that, Baja, and thanks to you all. I'm really excited about this conversation. So our first question is, how has your city's resilience plan been used as an agent of change, including as a pathway to measurably reduce babies' exposures to toxic chemicals? Baja, would you like to start?
Sure. So I don't directly work for any one city. I work for a network of 240 local governments in US and Canada. And I think maybe I'll give a little grounding for why I think the definition of resilience is so important to discuss first. The reframing of resilience is really critical in this conversation. And as I mentioned, the sort of interconnectivity of climate and racial equity. So when we're working on one, we're working on the other. And too often the environmental and climate movements have disconnected the work from people, especially people who have suffered for centuries due to systemic racism. So I think acknowledging that our systems are deeply flawed, they were intended to serve white male landowners, and that those systems have built-in privileges for white people is something we have to bring into this conversation around resilience, and to acknowledge that Black, Indigenous, people of color were sacrificed for the benefit of others. And so when we are talking about resilience, we're not talking about resilience as far as what we hear from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association of bouncing back or building back better, but rather, how are we thinking about whole humans? How are we thinking about respect? How are we getting back to a space where we're recognizing the reality of this country and the fact that our systems and structures need to change? And so in doing resilience work, we need to be thinking of resilience holistically, year round, something that isn't just centered around a hazard or a disruption, but is actually centered around the people and the people who are living in disadvantaged situations or have been most marginalized due to our racist practices and policies. So it massively impacts, obviously, children and babies because of the conditions that so many grow up in, the resources they have available to them, the access to programming and services, the support for mental and physical health, these different layers of trauma and intergenerational trauma. So I think that as we're talking about resilience and sort of this large term that's very similar to sustainability, that it can be a catch-all for a lot of things, the way that we need to redefine resilience or consider resilience in this planning process or just in the implementation we're doing must be centered on humans rather than infrastructure. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of our local governments do, which is pretty inspiring. So I'm going to turn over to Grant and Lottie because they've got the inspiration.
Thanks, Baja. And yeah, I would be interested to hear from both of you, especially about how we can do better at having this human-centered resilience. So Grant, could you go?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things we learned in going through our resilience strategy is exactly kind of, what Baja is talking about is an evolution right in the middle of the process in terms of, really first initiating the process because we're thinking about the physical nature of the city and those infrastructure issues. So we began a process that, looked at, flood risk and aging infrastructure and, really kind of applying for the first time the lens of shocks and stressors over top of city planning. So those shocks being potential immediate negative impacts, those stressors, those slow moving, long-standing challenges that we acknowledge, like systemic racism or aging infrastructure, but we endure it. And we don't confront it every day in a real meaningful way. And about midway through that process, we realized that there is more to this conversation, that it is about the people that we are here to serve, and the residents and neighbors that we live with. And so, really what transformed us was kind of this human manifestation of how we build out a citywide strategy, and that you can't do just one. You have to be able to kind of, bring them together in a holistic way. And what that starts to yield, I think, is something that is a fundamental shift for how we plan and how we develop policies and programs, is that we start to look in seeking co-benefits instead of just single solutions for a project. We're looking at kind of how a project can improve or address some of those shocks or stressors that we identify in our strategy, and how do we fundamentally start to shift and make those changes. One of the things in coming out of our 1PGH resilience strategy, then kind of having those lessons learned, was really starting to dive deeper in these issues of inequality. And we were part of a cohort of cities with the City University of New York, who crafted an equity indicators project. So effectively starting to measure for the first time as city government, acknowledging that inequality and equity are challenges that we face and have faced because of these systemic problems, but where can we move the needle in terms of improving kind of people's lives? And this issue of human health was one that rose quickly to the top, particularly for some of our disadvantaged populations. And the one example that sticks out kind of most formatively for me is the issue of asthma. So folks in the environmental community often think about the areas of pollution and impacts and pollution, mobile point source, as well as kind of point source pollutants. But when we started to look at the data, we were seeing that African-American boys were disproportionately experiencing incidents of asthma. And so that health risk has a multiplier effect on a host of other indicators. And so what those decisions for us have now started to lead to different investment decisions, programmatic decisions to make investments, as well as kind of the delivery of services that help to try to alleviate those challenges. And so that's where like the planning helps, the acknowledgement, but then when you start to have to make a decision, it starts to influence your decision-making process to be a more holistic delivery system.
Thanks, Gran. Thanks for pointing out how you changed midstream. Lottie, we're interested in your perspective, since you're at the very front end of your resilience planning, and how you're approaching the way forward.
Well, first, I think I need to go have coffee with both Baja and Grant, because they were speaking my language in their explanations. Flint has a long history of disinvestment. It's a predominantly Black community. Poverty rates are high. And so post-water crisis, there was a lot of money put into programs, but not necessarily the aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced that caused some of the problems that Flint has. And so years of infrastructure neglect has caused problems specifically related to, public health, the water crisis and the lead in water. But what Flint has also done is named racism a public health crisis. And so we identify that this structural racism is a huge part of the problem and the reason why we're here today. But we've got to take these pockets of programs and services and put them together in a comprehensive resilience plan. And that's what I'm hoping to do.
Okay, great. And I know a big part of that is involving the community and engaging the community. And so that moves us on to, how do you make sure that the voice of the community is heard and valued as a part of this holistic resilience planning? And what happens when you have too much input and too little? And how is that engagement continued throughout the entire process? So Lottie, we'll start with you, please.
So first, I don't think it's possible to get too much community input. So the key is to put measures in place to make sure that you have the capacity to receive that input, to process that input, and then consider it really consider their input. There are huge problems with not receiving enough input from residents because then they don't believe that the plan is theirs. They don't buy into the support strategies. Partnering organizations don't buy in. And then there is a reduced amount of potential funding that can be attracted because you don't have the support of all the people that you need in order to get the plan moving. But how would you know that there's too little input? So if you come up with strategies and those strategies don't line up with what the community believes should be priority, believe me, you will hear about it. You have to be willing to leave your office to listen to the people. You have to be willing, when it's safe, obviously, you know, we've got COVID to deal with right now, but you've got to be willing to leave your office. You've got to be able to go places where people organically gather. A lot of times we look for community support by saying, hey, let's all meet at this scary, intimidating building and talk about what your needs are. In my opinion, that's just not the way to go about it. So you go to places where people organically gather and you start conversations. And this is another reason why it's extremely important to have diverse staff, so you can send the right people to the right places to ask the right questions and be able to pull the right information. You have to really listen what they're saying and then be willing to pivot when necessary.
Thanks, Lottie. And Baja, from your perspective of working with multiple cities, can you speak to this? And also, you know, as Lottie brought up some specific examples from cities of how the community engagement is done in a way that's been successful and authentic.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think Lottie hit the nail on the head. It's really respect-based. We have to value people and their time, their experiences, and acknowledge their experience as part of the process. And it's often something where we do a lot of planning in the office, as Lottie mentioned, or doing a lot of assumption-based work early in the office, and then coming into the community and asking for, what do you think about this? Or give us feedback. I'm an urban planner, and one of the traditional things we were taught is to bring in the sticky notes so everybody can put a sticky note on the map. I really think we need to get out of that approach and to shift more to active listening, as Lottie said, to more humility in the process, to recognize that even though we might have certain positions in government or in certain organizations, that doesn't give us any ability, my opinion is, it doesn't mean that we know any better than the people who are experiencing this on a daily basis. I think as part of the respect and in bringing people in early in the process, it's also acknowledging that we need to value their time. So we need to be actively paying for their time or making sure there is a value to them. And there's a difference. In Hawaii, a lot of the people who are engaged or part of process don't want to be paid, but they want access to information or access to resources regarding their watershed. Whereas here where I live in Baltimore, people definitely wanted to be paid. And so we made sure that we used gift cards and really considered them as implementation partners rather than separate from the process. And I think that's really key. And just to build on what Lottie said, meeting people where they gather and go, like, so critical, but let's not assume that it's always the people within government who should be doing that. And I think there's a real great ambassador model that's happening in cities like Cleveland, where it's setting up ambassadors to go out and have conversations with folks that they know, going to hair salons, going to barbershops, sitting on stoops, and having those conversations with the eventual goal of talking about what people like or dislike or want to see or their experience. But having that active listening be brought in by people where the trust already exists rather than from government and where the distrust actively exists. So there are some really great ambassador models out there. There's really great models for how to pay for people's time. But I think the more that we bring humility into the process and respect into the process, the better outcomes they'll be.
Thanks, Baja. And Grant, I'd like to give you the opportunity to weigh in too on your experience with community in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. One is in listening to Lottie, it reminds me, like, community engagement is never done. It shouldn't be a checkbox as a part of a project, but it's really it's a continuous process, you know, a continuous process of improvement, I think, and that when you're in each phase of a project or an issue or the development of something, there should be check-in points with the community to help elicit that type of feedback that Baja and Lottie are talking about, because ultimately it starts to improve the outcomes. That's one thing. Second thing is, I'm really interested in, and this is more just a reflection, over the course of the pandemic, how community engagement is shifting. So one of the key tools that we utilized during our development of our climate action plan and our resilience strategy was deliberative forums, which really, you know, pull people together and have the ability of diverse viewpoints and differing opinions to have a conversation in small groups, which was really effective, I think, in terms of bringing in a variety of voices. And we can't do that now. We can't get in a physical space together. But what we have seen through a couple of the different online platforms that we've been able to develop is an increased participation, because people are able to plug in a more flexible way. So finding ways in which to utilize those in-person gathering kind of opportunities, whether it's the individual kind of, you know, engagements that Baja is talking about, or a deliberative forum kind of event, how we match that with technology going forward, I think is going to be a real interesting part. And then one final plug, I think, you know, I came out of the community organizing space, and that's a lot of like kind of what we're talking about. And, you know, systemically over the last 15, 20 years, we have disinvested in community organizing. And that has been to our detriment, I think, in a lot of different facets in terms of how we organize communities, how we organize and shape power, but ultimately like how we connect with people. You know, I mean, just my own personal experience, like that's when you're really meeting people, is in those kind of engagement opportunities. It's really strong because it builds both personal relationships, which also builds trust. And that's one of the things that, because of that disinvestment, we're seeing a lot of lack of trust in our system currently.
Thank you so much. And as we bring up aging infrastructure and disinvestment in community organizing, it kind of moves us to a question I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds, is how can the resilience planning process in cities help cities secure this federal infrastructure spending, particularly funding that would support toxic-free environments for pregnant women and kids, but of course that would spill over to neighborhood benefits. And I think this is an important topic, and I'd like to give everybody a chance to weigh in. So we'll start with you, Grant.
So you're asking like the connection with kind of federal funding and how that loops in. You know, one of the pieces I think that's really formative is really taking like a health first approach, in terms of when we think about infrastructure in particular, is like, how is this, how can and does an investment in infrastructure improve human health? So thinking through like the social determinants of health as kind of an organizing factor is one way in which I think to do that in terms of building out the framework of how and where to apply an infrastructure investment. Because the yield that we should be seeking is beyond that of a financial yield. Because there's, going back to the terminology of co-benefits, there's a number of other ways in which we can measure improved outcome, and health improvements in health outcomes is one of the critical ways, and think that we can start to apply that to the infrastructure lens, if you will.
Okay, thank you very much. And Baja, how can resilience planning tie into infrastructure funds?
Yeah, it's interesting because resilience is a really big term, right? And if we're thinking about the framing of resilience, just like sustainability, just like health, fits into everything. I think there is a real opportunity for all of us to challenge the current federal structure. And there's people listening right now. And so the way that money traditionally flows into one-year grants and to a very specific sector, and you can't use that money beyond planning, or you can't pay people to be able to participate. we need to challenge that. And I think seeking more flexibility and adaptability in the funding and more connectivity in the funding. There's so much intersection between, as Grant said, what we need to do around infrastructure and human health, but also just accessibility, resources, other things. So I think that we have an opportunity to sort of challenge this current administration to get out of the archaic model of funding that we've been in for many decades. I think, as Grant said, that health first approach and sort of bringing in social determinants of health, but also challenging the way that we're measuring success and the timelines associated with these budgets. There's a real opportunity to seek, hey, we need multi-year funding if we're going to work on a really big project that centers people and asks for their feedback and brings the community in as an active partner and an actual implementation partner. Same with the way that we're thinking about being able to distribute that funding. It's typically something where a local government has to put out an RFP and go to one consultant. But one consultant typically isn't good at all of the different elements that are part of resilience. And so we need the mental health experts. We need the folks who are really working on the environmental components and the ecological components. We need to be able to bring in multiple different stakeholders and multiple different teams to be more holistic in our approach, because right now we have siloed so much, and the traditional siloing is really harming the ability to do the work.
Maja, I'm wondering if you could give a quick kind of practical example of how to do this challenge so that the people that are listening do listen and that change happens. Like, what is the specific channel to the challenge?
Well, we're still in the first 100 days of this administration, and I think they're actively seeking input and information, in all these different areas. And so that is something that USDN is trying to do, is organize with a lot of our local governments to say, these are the things we want to see. We want to see the connectivity between HUD and FEMA and these different opportunities where they obviously intersect, but right now they're massively disconnected. So one opportunity I can think of immediately is sort of a very archaic plan, but the hazard mitigation plan, where right now it's still, very much structured around what we've already seen and thinking about how we're going to mitigate against those disruptions, rather than bringing in the climate science, rather than bringing in the social equity and thinking more proactively. There's a real opportunity in using that document, whether you create a standalone resilience document or integrate resilience into that mandated document, which will help local governments be able to identify lots of different sources of funding for implementation. You can bring in EPA funding, you can bring in FEMA funding, you can bring in flood mitigation assistance, you can bring in all these different sources of funding into this one mandated document, rather than having to create 6 different separate documents that also align with the 6 different funding strategies.
Thank you for lifting that up, Baja. And Lottie, I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in about how to connect the planning, resilience planning, whatever you find most appropriate, to federal infrastructure funding that's available now.
So I don't know how much more I can add to both of those fantastic responses, but I will add something that my grandmother told me often, and that is, you don't have to get ready if you stay ready. And we need to put that lens on the way we build our own programs, make sure that they are easily expandable. So when we do have those opportunities for funding, that we're ready to go, that we don't have to try to pull together a plan to make something happen. Build flexibility into your programs, so when it happens, you're good to go.
I think you and your grandmother added something important to the conversation, Lottie. And moving on to our next question, and thinking strategically about how to tie different documents and planning exercises together, I'm curious what strategies you have all used to link elements of your resilience plan to the city's master plan, and how do you make sure that both of those documents remain relevant, and that, if you do have provisions for reducing neurotoxic exposures or toxic exposures, that those are binding. Grant, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, 2 things, and just and Baja said something that made me think about something too, is one of the key ways in which we can help make sure that these things happen is that in those federal infrastructure investments is that we invest in the planning and engagement. So like as part of budgets, as part of kind of the federal programming, it shouldn't be just for bricks and mortar, but investing in engagement is a critical investment. That's number one. Number two, the other thing, and this is maybe just a quick plug for the resilience officer position to your question, is it's important to have somebody that can serve as an integrator, and is able to work across the silos and the different departments within city government, but also to have connections to other sectors. And so building cross-department as well as cross-sector collaboration is really critical, because while we're, the four of us are having this conversation, 95% of city government is thinking about, their particular activity and role that they are charged with within the civil service, right? Likewise in the advocacy space, so if you're a health advocate, are you necessarily a housing advocate? Are you necessarily an environmental advocate, right? So like the ability to connect dots between sectors, between departments, that's not natural. And so that's really one of the things that, I've discovered in this role, that it's critical to have an integrator, and a person that has the ability to kind of bridge and connect dots and bring folks together.
Thank you, Grant. Lottie, would you like to weigh in on that about how linking elements of your resilience plan to your master plan?
I want to piggyback a bit on what Grant just mentioned. And there are people who routinely, at least in our community, get left out of these types of conversations. And those are the folks who are in the back offices, in the basement, that are part of the zoning board, the planning and commission, the planning and development staff. They've got a lot of the knowledge that we need to integrate the resilience plan with the master plan, and we don't always go talk to them. So the folks that the city engineers, make sure that you're including all of those people in their conversations and in their input, because they know infrastructure, they know the zoning ordinances and the laws, and they understand all the technicalities of things that happen. And so be sure to include those folks in your planning.
Thank you for bringing that up. Can I push on you just a bit? And have you formalized that in some way, that you have monthly convenings at an appropriate place? Or is this just like a point of awareness that we need to do this in a more organic way forward?
So yeah, a point of awareness, definitely, but it is part of our plan to make sure zoning board, planning commission, planning and development staff are all included in this process. And so we've started up, we have talks weekly with the planning department, and those will increase as more than a week is a lot, but we need them to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Lottie. And Baja, would you like to weigh in on how you see the connections between those two?
Yeah, I think as both Lottie and Grant have said, there's a real need for this sort of connector, right? And a master plan is intended to be a connector. If we're utilizing a master plan, the master plan itself has an opportunity to shift and change the process and approach. We have this very traditional master planning process that is essentially perpetuating everything we've talked about being wrong on this call. So I think the mentality around a city's master plan needs to get beyond the plan. It's actually a process shift. The way we approach the work, the way we bring everyone into it respectfully, the way we're paying for things, even the topics that we're talking about. The master plan is that big connector. And so the way we approach the master planning process needs to change. And I think that a core component of that is actually taking a targeted universalism approach, which I want to credit the Haas Institute in Berkeley, where it's recognizing that all people's needs matter, but we have to be prioritizing our BIPOC communities that have been intentionally marginalized for decades. And that needs to be brought into our capital improvement budgeting, into our operations and maintenance budgeting. We need to be bringing it into our human health components and making that connectivity. And so I think master plans have a tendency to just, again, be very traditional, very archaic. We have to change that process, and we need to center around people and humans and quality of life over this idea of the traditional plan.
Aja, could you give us any specific examples of cities that have sort of taken a new approach to their master planning? I'm sorry, the Haas Institute, that approach, or other cities that are more progressive in their master planning process at this point?
I hesitate to call out any one city over another, because I think all cities and counties have unique structures and a unique set of support system. It's not like, you can be in a space where the mayor, council, and all the department directors disagree with your approach, and that's magically going to happen anyways. So I think this is kind of why I'm a little bit against the idea of like, let's just put together more case studies. I think we actually need to get into the storytelling of what didn't work and why it didn't work, or what did align and why it aligned well, instead of this idea of like, everything was just amazing and we were able to do it. There's really the need for the support and to have the sort of capacity for it. And so I will say that I've seen certain local governments really work to change process. And I don't want to call out any one plan, but I will say that certainly Providence, Rhode Island, when they were doing their climate work, they shifted to an entire racial justice plan and an equity plan that is now leading a lot of their sort of master planning work. I will say that the city of Fort Collins is intentionally changing all of the way that they process affordable housing work, master planning, other things, to bring in the targeted universalism approach. This isn't to say there's a complete master plan for anybody to go look at and replicate. It's much more about the process, and that's what I want to make really clear to anybody listening. Let's not just talk about the plan, let's get beyond the plan and think about the process shift.
Okay, thank you very much. Going back to those unique set of conditions in each city, let's talk about some strategies that you have used to engage your mayor, your executive council, other councils, and other leaders, particularly in your city government, but certainly in your community as well, as part of your resilience planning process. And Lottie, could we start with you?
Sure. I think Baja mentioned it earlier. Resilience is a huge word that encompasses a lot of different things. And if you talk to 5 different people, you'll get 5 different answers on what they believe resilience planning is. And so I think the first thing you have to do is to provide a level playing field for everyone involved, or everyone you want to be involved, to understand what exactly it is that you are hoping to do. And then you need to understand the landscape. Once all of the players understand what resilience planning is and how it can improve and promote strong communities, you have to engage leaders based on your own local rules of engagement, know the laws around convening elected officials, figure out what they're passionate about, and then reel them in based on that passion, so they can help you based on that knowledge. And then be efficient, be just as effective, or excuse me, not effective, but be just as protective with their time as you are with your own. So you want to provide opportunities for engagement that don't always involve a meeting. And when they do, make sure those meetings are purposeful and make sure they're short. Be intentional about every single part of that process. And then finally, I would say be transparent. Share as much information as you can, as often as you can, with elected leaders and the community. It's really, really hard to stay engaged if you just really don't know what's going on. And a lot of times people they keep things close to the chest until they have this big finished document in hand, and that's really not the right way to go about it. Within reason, then that plan should be published and indicate that it's a draft. Get feedback, always. Constant feedback is important. And then when it is at a point where you think it's complete, it really never will be, but when it's at a point where you think it's complete, you make sure that everybody that was a part of the process has a copy of it, or has access to a copy of it, along with your thanks for helping them with the plan.
Thank you so much, Lottie. And Grant, would you like to share any of your thoughts?
Yeah, one of the things that I would just add is that, the idea of continuous engagement and making your executive or your councils a part of the process is really important. Just like Lottie was talking about, engaging other members of city government, like they all have their experience, much like what we were talking about in terms of engaging a community. Excuse me, like they're members of the community too. And so like understanding kind of where they are at and what they're experiencing and how they can contribute to the development of a plan or strategy is important. The second thing that I would say is that what we've discovered, it's really important to understand the landscape on which you sit on, and where you can make an impact. So we working in city government, a lot of folks will bring you issues that you have no influence or control over. And so understanding what you do control or what you do have the ability to have an influence over is really important. Just for example, one of the key things that we're making a lot of headway in that we didn't really think of in the beginning is issues of procurement. And so procurement decisions that we can make in terms of allocating the city's spend and or our investment strategies. One of the things, for example, that was a part of our climate action plan was the development of a divestment measure from fossil fuels, which first started out with an environmental lens, to be truthful, but applying the resilience lens to it allowed us to start to think in terms of risk mitigation, but also in terms of being more inclusive to issues beyond just the environment. And so what we ended up developing was an ESG policy that includes a divestment from fossil fuels, a divestment from guns and ammo manufacturers, and then also a divestment from any investments in for-profit prisons. And what that did was create a more inclusive process in terms of how we are investing pension assets, but ultimately improving the outcomes and returns for our investors. That's a procurement decision. And so we're now kind of extending that into other areas of city procurement in terms of how we can create a more inclusive and just process.
Okay, thank you so much. And moving to our final question, it's that question about tools. In our conversation last month with other city leaders, Jacques Colon from Tacoma, Washington mentioned their equity index tool, which reminded me of the equity indicators you mentioned, Grant. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts on what tools for resilience planning, do you recommend? There's so many out there. Are they effective? And is there one that's actually, very useful in this process? And Baja, I'll give the floor to you.
I might just say something related to the last question real quick, which I think Lottie and Grant aren't able to really say, but I am because I'm not working directly for city government. And that is to acknowledge that egos and the egos of our mayors and council members have to be considered when you're thinking about support for the work. And so that's just something to know, that you have to show a connection to how they're going to get benefit, how they're going to have some press, how there is going to be something good for them. And that is something that is really, really critical as part of the work, but we never call it out because it's not actually something we can say when we work for government. So moving beyond that, as far as tools, and I think I've said this for a lot of years now, is we have way too many tools. We have thousands of green infrastructure tools and other tools. I think that again, this is sort of a pushing back on the idea of creating a tool for every single municipality or every single process to have, the specific tool for that specific need. It would be great to push back again on this idea of tool development. How can we bring these groups together to retrofit tools, to make the existing tools better, to bring in multiple stakeholders to own and enhance the tools? So I'm not, I'm a little bit against the idea of let's do more tools or call out the best tools, but I do think when I'm talking about process, because we've been talking a lot about process, I will mention we've had some really strong work done by our USDN members to come up with a process change. It's called the Nexus process, and essentially it's getting us out of the idea of linear decision-making, linear planning, and really bringing in that targeted universalism approach. Thinking about acknowledgement of power and shifting of power throughout every stage of what we're doing. And instead of, as Lottie said, getting to the end and just giving a plan at the end, actually checking in every time that we possibly can. And I think Grant mentioned this as well, that we're checking in with each other, we're checking in with our the stage that we're in, and we're also checking with our external partners to make sure that we're doing a good job. So I would mention that as a resource for process change, because I do think we need to shift away from tools and plans in the traditional.
Thank you, Baja. And Grant, what's your wisdom to share with us about tools or no tools?
I would say two things. One is, and these are just, kind of principles of resilience, right? Which is, one is understanding it's important to be networked and to build networks. And getting out of your traditional networks is also very important. And so that's important, I think, in terms of how we approach like inclusion. And also when we talk about project delivery, because ultimately, the idea of continuous engagement is going to require that you lean on those networks that you're building, because in many cases, those are the activators or the implementers of change. So that networking is very important, and build new and non-traditional networks. The second thing I would say is it's important to be adaptive. So you're going to go into a process, and you're going to experience a variety of hiccups and potholes and pitfalls throughout the development of any type of planning process. And that is the actual, I think, one of the essences of resilience is we developed what was called a preliminary resilience assessment prior to developing our strategy, which is an evaluation of shocks or stressors. And we have experienced every one of those shocks and stressors that we identified since we developed the preliminary resilience assessment in 2015. And so that type of analysis of understanding, the landscape or the playing field, I think is really important, and that landscape or playing field is going to change. And you have to be able to, I think, in my opinion, accept that. Because if you don't, that takes you down a path that you really, you don't want to be on. So, building networking and then being willing and able to adapt is really critical.
Thanks, Grant. And Lottie, what do you think about tools?
So I can definitely respect the fact that there are lots and lots of tools out there, and we use them for all sorts of things. And I agree that we shouldn't create more tools, but there are lots of us who are new to this resilience planning process who can greatly benefit from what we learn from those tools, whether we use them throughout the process or not. We'll find out, but it's another avenue to learn this work. And so I'll ask Baja and Grant offline what their favorite tools are, so they can share them with me.
And I'll share that out because I'm curious too. Well, it's been awesome to be in conversation with everybody in our audience. We're coming to our closers. And so I'd like to ask each of our panelists to share a pearl with each of us that we can take forward to proactively continue this work. And so let's start with you, Grant. One pearl for our audience.
Yeah, pearl for our audience. I would say that, this is just a personal reflection, and my journey, it started talking with Baja actually way back in 2014 is have these conversations with other professionals in this space, because what you will garner from them is invaluable. And so that it's an important part of that journey is just to connect with other professionals and build that network, because you're going to learn the lessons that they have learned, and you're going to be passing them on at some point. So I would kind of just make that as one of my key recommendations.
Thank you, Grant. And what pearl would you like to share, Lottie?
I actually was going to share something similar, that if you have a good network of people, then that makes this work a whole lot easier. And so I am grateful to you and for the opportunity to be here, because I've picked up a couple more tools in my belt in Grant and Baja.
Thank you, Lottie. And Baja, what pearl would you like to share?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much the reason I work for USDN is because of the power of relationships, the power of network, the power of trust. And some of the most amazing humans get to connect through really trusted and relationship focused opportunities, and to collaborate and have the flexibility and space to be innovative, to try something different, to feel like they have the support to be able to do that in a safe space. And so I think that certainly the network is incredible, relationships and trust are incredible, but I think for all of us, if I was gonna say there's a pearl, is to remember that we all need to feel safe in the work. And so as we're approaching different stakeholders and different folks to bring them in, to make sure we're providing a safe space for them requires a different approach. You know, I've had politicians who just need to be able to process some of the things we're telling them around needing to completely relocate their entire community. And if it's done out in public and done in a space where they can't process that first and understand it, it's not safe for them. And they will immediately go to build back better. Nope, we're going to beat water. We're going to win over nature. And I think that the more we approach all of our relationships and all of our opportunities with a creating of a safe space, the better off we're all going to be.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Grant, Lottie, and Basha, you know, for sharing your time and your really incredible insights. And I feel like this is just a foundation to keep moving forward. I don't see any other questions, but feel free if you have one to pop one in there. I just have a few more things, especially to our audience for taking the time to join the conversation, and another shout out to please, and you know, continue in partnership with us and Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. Apply for the RFP, and I'd love to hear all of your ideas by April 16th, if not before. Lastly, I also wanted to announce our $1,000 prize winner, and so this money goes to your city to support or seed an action that lifts up the co-benefits of protecting babies as part of your climate resilience or sustainability